Parnassus on Wheels, the famous novel by Christopher Morley. Part 1. A letter to David Grayson, ESQ of Hempfield, USA. My dear sir, although my name appears on the title page, the real author of this book is Miss Helen McGill, now Mrs. Roger Mifflin, who told me the story with her own inimitable vivacity. And on her behalf, I want to send to you these few words of acknowledgement. Mrs. Mifflin, I need hardly say, is unskilled in the arts of authorship. This is her first book, and I doubt whether she will ever write another. She hardly realized, I think, how much her story owes to your own delightful writings. There used to be a well-thumbed copy of Adventures in Contentment on her table at the Sabine farm, and I have seen her pick it up after a long day in the kitchen, read it with chuckles, and say that the story of you and Harriet reminded her of herself and Andrew. She used to mutter something about adventures in discontentment, and ask why Harriet's side of the matter was never told. And so, when her own adventure came to pass, and she was urged to put it on paper, I think she unconsciously adopted something of the manner and matter that you have made properly yours. Surely, sir, you will not disown so innocent a tribute. At any rate, Miss Harriet Grayson, whose excellent qualities we have all so long admired, will find in Mrs. Mifflin a kindred spirit. Mrs. Mifflin would have said this for herself, with her characteristic definiteness of speech, had she not been out of touch with her publishers and foolscap paper. She and the professor are on their Parnassus, somewhere on the high roads, happily engrossed in the most godly diversion known to man, selling books. And I venture to think that there are no volumes they take more pleasure in recommending than the wholesome and invigorating books which bear your name. Believe me, dear Mr. Grayson, with warm regards. Faithfully yours, Christopher Morley. Chapter 1. I wonder if there isn't a lot of bunkum in higher education. I never found that people who were learned in logarithms and other kinds of poetry were any quicker in washing dishes or darning socks. I've done a good deal of reading when I could, and I don't want to admit impediments to the love of books. But I've also seen lots of good practical folk spoiled by too much fine print. Reading sonnets always gives me hiccups, too. I never expected to be an author, but I do think there are some amusing things about the story of Andrew and myself and how books broke up our placid life. When John Gutenberg, whose real name, so the professor says, was John Gooseflesh, borrowed that money to set up his printing press, he launched a lot of troubles on the world. Andrew and I were wonderfully happy on the farm until he became an author. If I could have foreseen all the bother his writings were to cause us, I would certainly have burnt the first manuscript in the kitchen stove. Andrew McGill, the author of those books everyone reads, is my brother. In other words, I am his sister, 10 years younger. Years ago, Andrew was a businessman, but his health failed and, like so many people in the storybooks, he fled to the country, or, as he called it, to the bosom of nature. He and I were the only ones left in an unsuccessful family. I was slowly perishing as a conscientious governess in the brownstone region of New York. He rescued me from that, and we bought a farm with our combined savings. We became real farmers, up with the sun and to bed with the same. Andrew wore overalls and a soft shirt and grew brown and tough. My hands got red and blue with soapsuds and frost. I never saw a Redfern advertisement from one year's end to another, and my kitchen was a battlefield where I set my teeth and learned to love hard work. Our literature was government agriculture reports, patent medicine almanacs, seedsmen's booklets, and Sears Roebuck catalogs. We subscribed to Farm and Fireside and read the serials aloud. Every now and then, for real excitement, we read something stirring in the Old Testament. That cheery book Jeremiah, for instance, of which Andrew was very fond. The farm did actually prosper after a while, and Andrew used to hang over the pasture bars at sunset and tell, from the way his pipe burned, just what the weather would be the next day. As I have said, we were tremendously happy until Andrew got the fatal idea of telling the world how happy we were. I am sorry to have to admit he had always been rather a bookish man. In his college days, he had edited the Student's magazine, and sometimes he would get discontented with the Farm and Fireside serials and pull down his bound volumes of the college paper. He would read me some of his youthful poems and stories and mutter vaguely about writing something himself someday. I was more concerned with sitting hens than with sonnets, and I'm bound to say I never took these threats very seriously. I should have been more severe. Then Great-Uncle Philip died, and his carload of books came to us. He had been a college professor, and years ago, when Andrew was a boy, Uncle Philip had been very fond of him, had, in fact, put him through college. We were the only near relatives, and all those books turned up one fine day. That was the beginning of the end, if I had only known it. Andrew had the time of his life building shelves all around our living room. Not content with that, he turned the old hen house into a study for himself, put in a stove, and used to sit up there evenings after I'd gone to bed. The first thing I knew, he called the place Sabine Farm, although it had been known for years as Bog Hollow, because he thought it a literary thing to do. He used to take a book along with him when he drove over to Redfield for supplies. Sometimes the wagon would be 2 hours late coming home, with old Ben loafing along between the shafts and Andrew lost in his book. I didn't think much of all this, but I'm an easygoing woman, and as long as Andrew kept the farm going, I had plenty to do on my own hook. Hot bread and coffee, eggs and preserves for breakfast, soup and hot meat, vegetables, dumplings, gravy, brown bread and white, huckleberry pudding, chocolate cake and buttermilk for dinner, muffins, tea, sausage rolls, blackberries and cream, and donuts for supper. That's the kind of menu I'd been preparing 3 times a day for years. I hadn't any time to worry about what wasn't my business. And then one morning, I caught Andrew doing up a big flat parcel for the postman. He looked so sheepish I just had to ask what it was. "I've written a book," said Andrew, and he showed me the title page. Paradise Regained by Andrew McGill. Even then, I wasn't much worried, because of course I knew no one would print it. But Lord, a month or so later came a letter from a publisher. Accepting it. That's the letter Andrew keeps framed above his desk. Just to show how such things sound, I'll copy it here. Decameron, Jones & Company, publisher, Union Square, New York, January 13th, 1907. Dear Mr. McGill, we have read with singular pleasure your manuscript Paradise Regained. There is no doubt in our minds that so spirited an account of the joys of sane country living should meet with popular approval. And, with the exception of a few revisions and abbreviations, we would be glad to publish the book practically as it stands. We would like to have it illustrated by Mr. Tortoni, some of whose work you may have seen, and would be glad to know whether he may call upon you in order to acquaint himself with the local color of your neighborhood. We would be glad to pay you a royalty of 10% upon the retail price of the book, and we enclose duplicate contracts for your signature in case this proves satisfactory to you. Believe us, etc., etc. Decameron, Jones & Company. I have since thought that Paradise Lost would have been a better title for that book. It was published in the autumn of 1907, and since that time our life has never been the same. By some mischance, the book became the success of the season. It was widely commended as a gospel of health and sanity, and Andrew received, in almost every mail, offers from publishers and magazine editors who wanted to get hold of his next book. It is almost incredible to what stratagems publishers will descend to influence an author. Andrew had written in Paradise Regained of the tramps who visit us. How quaint and appealing some of them are. Let me add, how dirty. And how we never turn away anyone who seems worthy. Would you believe that in the spring after the book was published, a disreputable-looking vagabond with a knapsack who turned up one day, blarneyed Andrew about his book and stayed overnight, announced himself at breakfast as a leading New York publisher? He had chosen this ruse in order to make Andrew's acquaintance. You can imagine that it didn't take long for Andrew to become spoiled at this rate. The next year, he suddenly disappeared, leaving only a note on the kitchen table, and tramped all over the state for 6 weeks collecting material for a new book. I had all I could do to keep him from going to New York to talk to editors and people of that sort. Envelopes of newspaper cuttings used to come to him, and he would pore over them when he ought to have been plowing corn. Luckily, the mailman comes along about the middle of the morning when Andrew is out in the fields, so I used to look over the letters before he saw them. After the second book, Happiness and Hayseed, it was called, was printed. Letters from publishers got so thick that I used to put them all in the stove before Andrew saw them, except those from the Decameron Jones people, which sometimes held checks. Literary folk used to turn up now and then to interview Andrew, but generally I managed to head them off. But Andrew got to be less and less of a farmer and more of a literary man. He bought a typewriter. He would hang over the pig pen, noting down adjectives for the sunset instead of mending the weather vane on the barn, which took a slew so that the north wind came from the southwest. He hardly ever looked at the Sears Roebuck catalogs anymore, and after Mr. Decameron came to visit us and suggested that Andrew write a book of country poems, the man became simply unbearable. And all the time I was counting eggs and turning out 3 meals a day and running the farm when Andrew got a literary fit and would go off on some vagabond jaunt to collect adventures for a new book. I wish you could have seen the state he was in when he came back from these trips, hoboing it along the roads without any money or a clean sock to his back. One time he returned with a cough you could hear the other side of the barn, and I had to nurse him for 3 weeks. When somebody wrote a little booklet about the Sage of Redfield and described me as a rural Xantippe and the domestic balance wheel that kept the great writer close to the homely realities of life, I made up my mind to give Andrew some of his own medicine. And that's my story. Chapter 2. It was a fine, crisp morning in fall, October, I dare say, and I was in the kitchen coring apples for applesauce. We were going to have roast pork for dinner with boiled potatoes and what Andrew calls Van Dyke brown gravy. Andrew had driven over to town to get some flour and feed and wouldn't be back till noontime. Being a Monday, Mrs. McNally, the washerwoman, had come over to take care of the washing. I remember I was just on my way out to the woodpile for a few sticks of birch when I heard wheels turn in at the gate. There was one of the fattest white horses I ever saw and a queer wagon shaped like a van. A funny-looking little man with a red beard leaned forward from the seat and said something. I didn't hear what it was. I was looking at that preposterous wagon of his. It was colored a pale robin's egg blue, and on the side, in big scarlet letters, was painted, R. Mifflin's Traveling Parnassus. Good books for sale. Shakespeare, Charles Lamb, RLS, Hazlitt, and all others. Underneath the wagon, in slings, hung what looked like a tent, together with a lantern, a bucket, and other small things. The van had a raised skylight on the roof, something like an old-fashioned trolley car, and from one corner went up a stovepipe. At the back was a door with little windows on each side and a flight of steps leading up to it. As I stood looking at this queer turnout, the little reddish man climbed down from in front and stood watching me. His face was a comic mixture of pleasant drollery and a sort of weather-beaten cynicism. He had a neat little russet beard and a shabby Norfolk jacket. His head was very bald. "Is this where Andrew McGill lives?" he said. I admitted it. "But he's away until noon," I added. "He'll be back then. There's roast pork for dinner." "And applesauce," said the little man. "Applesauce and brown gravy," I said. "That's why I'm sure he'll be home on time. Sometimes he's late when there's boiled dinner, but never on roast pork days. Andrew would never do for a rabbi." A sudden suspicion struck me. "You're not another publisher, are you?" I cried. "What do you want with Andrew?" "I was wondering whether he wouldn't buy this outfit," said the little man, including, with a wave of the hand, both van and white horse. As he spoke, he released a hook somewhere and raised the whole side of his wagon like a flap. Some kind of catch clicked. The flap remained up like a roof, displaying nothing but books, rows and rows of them. The flank of his van was nothing but a big bookcase. Shelves stood above shelves, all of them full of books, both old and new. As I stood gazing, he pulled out a printed card from somewhere and gave it to me. "Roger Mifflin's Traveling Parnassus. Worthy friends my wain doth hold. Many a book, both new and old. Books, the truest friends of man, fill this rolling caravan. Books to satisfy all uses. Golden lyrics of the muses. Books on cookery and farming. Novels passionate and charming, every kind for every need. So that he who buys may read. What librarian can surpass us? Mifflin's Traveling Parnassus by R. Mifflin, proprietor." Star Job Print, Celeryville, Virginia. While I was chuckling over this, he had raised a similar flap on the other side of the Parnassus, which revealed still more shelves loaded with books. I'm afraid I am severely practical by nature. Well, I said, I should think you would need a pretty stout steed to lug that load along. It must weigh more than a coal wagon. Oh, Peg can manage it all right, he said. We don't travel very fast. But look here, I want to sell out. Do you suppose your husband would buy the outfit? Parnassus, Pegasus, and all? He's fond of books, isn't he? Hold on a minute, I said. Andrew's my brother, not my husband, and he's altogether too fond of books. Books will be the ruin of this farm pretty soon. He's mooning about over his books like a sitting hen about half the time, when he ought to be mending harness. Lord, if he saw this wagon load of yours, he'd be unsettled for a week. I have to stop the postman down the road and take all the publishers' catalogs out of the mail so that Andrew don't see 'em. I'm mighty glad he's not here just now, I can tell you. I'm not literary, as I said before, but I'm human enough to like a good book, and my eye was running along those shelves of his as I spoke. He certainly had a pretty miscellaneous collection. I noticed poetry, essays, novels, cookbooks, juveniles, school books, Bibles, and whatnot, all jumbled together. Well, see here, said the little man, and about this time I noticed that he had the bright eyes of a fanatic. I've been cruising with this Parnassus going on 7 years. I've covered the territory from Florida to Maine, and I reckon I've injected about as much good literature into the countryside as ever old Doc Elliott did with his 5-foot shelf. I want to sell out now. I'm going to write a book about literature among the farmers, and want to settle down with my brother in Brooklyn and write it. I've got a sack full of notes for it. I guess I'll just stick around until Mr. McGill gets home and see if he won't buy me out. I'll sell the whole concern, horse, wagon, and books, for $400. I've read Andrew McGill's stuff, and I reckon the proposition will interest him. I've had more fun with this Parnassus than a barrel of monkeys. I used to be a school teacher till my health broke down. Then I took this up, and I've made more than expenses and had the time of my life. Well, Mr. Mifflin, I said, if you want to stay around, I guess I can't stop you. But I'm sorry you and your old Parnassus ever came this way. I turned on my heel and went back to the kitchen. I knew pretty well that Andrew would go up in the air when he saw that wagon load of books and one of those crazy cards with Mr. Mifflin's poetry on it. I must confess that I was considerably upset. Andrew is just as unpractical and fanciful as a young girl, and always dreaming of new adventures and rambles around the country. If he ever saw that traveling Parnassus, he'd fall for it like snap. And I knew Mr. Decameron was after him for a new book anyway. I'd intercepted one of his letters suggesting another happiness and hayseed trip just a few weeks before. Andrew was away when the letter came. I had a suspicion what was in it. So I opened it, read it, and, well, burnt it. Heavens, as though Andrew didn't have enough to do without mooning down the road like a tinker just to write a book about it. As I worked around the kitchen, I could see Mr. Mifflin making himself at home. He unhitched his horse, tied her up to the fence, sat down by the woodpile, and lit a pipe. I could see I was in for it. By and by, I couldn't stand it any longer. I went out to talk to that bald-headed peddler. See here, I said, you're a pretty cool fish to make yourself so easy in my yard. I tell you I don't want you around here, you and your traveling Parcheesi. Suppose you clear out of here before my brother gets back and don't be breaking up our happy family. Miss McGill, he said. The man had a pleasant way with him too, darn him, with his bright twinkling eye and his silly little beard. I'm sure I don't want to be discourteous. If you move me on from here, of course I'll go. But I warn you I shall lie in wait for Mr. McGill just down this road. I'm here to sell this caravan of culture, and by the bones of Swinburne I think your brother's the man to buy it. My blood was up now, and I'll admit that I said my next without proper calculation. Rather than have Andrew buy your old Parcheesi, I said, I'll buy it myself. I'll give you $300 for it. The little man's face brightened. He didn't either accept or decline my offer. I was frightened to death that he'd take me right on the nail, and bang would go my 3 years' savings for a Ford. Come and have another look at her, he said. I must admit that Mr. Roger Mifflin had fixed up his van mighty comfortably inside. The body of the wagon was built out on each side over the wheels, which gave it an unwieldy appearance but made extra room for the bookshelves. This left an inside space about 5 feet wide and 9 long. On one side, he had a little oil stove, a flap table, and a cozy-looking bunk above which was built a kind of chest of drawers. To hold clothes and such things, I suppose. On the other side, more bookshelves, a small table, and a little wicker easy chair. Every possible inch of space seemed to be made useful in some way for a shelf or a hook or a hanging cupboard or something. Above the stove was a neat little row of pots and dishes and cooking usefuls. The raised skylight made it just possible to stand upright in the center aisle of the van, and a little sliding window opened onto the driver's seat in front. Altogether, it was a very neat affair. The windows in front and back were curtained, and a pot of geraniums stood on a diminutive shelf. I was amused to see a sandy Irish terrier curled up on a bright Mexican blanket in the bunk. "Miss McGill," he said, "I couldn't sell Parnassus for less than 400. I've put twice that much into her, one time and another. She's built clean and solid all through, and there's everything a man would need from blankets to bouillon cubes. The whole thing's yours for $400, including dog, cook stove, and everything. Jib, boom, and spanker. There's a tent and a sling underneath, and an ice box." He pulled up a little trapdoor under the bunk, "and a tank of coal oil and Lord knows what all. She's as good as a yacht, but I'm tired of her. If you're so afraid of your brother taking a fancy to her, why don't you buy her yourself and go off on a lark? Make him stay home and mind the farm. Tell you what I'll do. I'll start you on the road myself, come with you the first day and show you how it's worked. You could have the time of your life in this thing, and give yourself a fine vacation. It would give your brother a good surprise, too. Why not?" I don't know whether it was the neatness of his absurd little van, or the madness of the whole proposition, or just the desire to have an adventure of my own and play a trick on Andrew. But anyway, some extraordinary impulse seized me and I roared with laughter. "Right," I said. "I'll do it. I, Helen McGill, in the 39th year of my age." Chapter 3. Well, I thought, if I'm in for an adventure, I may as well be spry about it. Andrew will be home by 12:30, and if I'm going to give him the slip, I'd better get a start. I suppose he'll think I'm crazy? He'll follow me, I guess. Well, he just shan't catch me, that's all. A kind of anger came over me to think that I'd been living on that farm for nearly 15 years. Yes, sir, ever since I was 25. And hardly ever been away except for that trip to Boston once a year to go shopping with Cousin Edie. I'm a homekeeping soul, I guess, and I love my kitchen and my preserve cupboard and my linen closet as well as grandmother ever did. But something in that blue October air and that crazy little red-bearded man just tickled me. "Look here, Mr. Parnassus," I said. "I guess I'm a fat old fool, but I just believe I'll do that. You hitch up your horse and van, and I'll go pack some clothes and write you a check. It'll do Andrew all the good in the world to have me skip. I'll get a chance to read a few books, too. It'll be as good as going to college." And I untied my apron and ran for the house. The little man stood leaning against a corner of the van as if he were stupefied. I dare say he was. I ran into the house through the front door, and it struck me as comical to see a copy of one of Andrew's magazines lying on the living room table with "The Revolt of Womanhood" printed across it in red letters. Here goes for the revolt of Helen McGill, I thought. I sat down at Andrew's desk, pushed aside a pad of notes he had been jotting down about the magic of autumn, and scrawled a few lines. "Dear Andrew, don't be thinking I'm crazy. I've gone off for an adventure. It just came over me that you've had all the adventures while I've been at home baking bread. Mrs. McNally will look after your meals, and one of her girls can come over to do the housework. So don't worry, I'm going off for a little while, a month maybe, to see some of this happiness and hayseed of yours. It's what the magazines call the revolt of womanhood. Warm underwear in the cedar chest in the spare room when you need it. With love, Helen." I left the note on his desk. Mrs. McNally was bending over the tubs in the laundry. I could see only the broad arch of her back and hear the vigorous zzz of her rubbing. She straightened up at my call. "Mrs. McNally," I said, "I'm going away for a little trip. You'd better let the washing go until this afternoon and get Andrew's dinner for him. He'll be back about 12:30. It's 10:30 now. You tell him I've gone over to see Mrs. Collins at Locust Farm. Mrs. McNally is a brawny, slow-witted Swede." "All right, Miss McGill," she said. You be back to dinner? No, I'm not coming back for a month, I said. I'm going away for a trip. I want you to send Rosie over here every day to do the housework while I'm away. You can arrange with Mr. McGill about that. I've got to hurry now. Mrs. McNally's honest eyes, as blue as Copenhagen china, gazing through the window in perplexity, fell upon the traveling Parnassus and Mr. Mifflin backing Pegasus into the shafts. I saw her make a valiant effort to comprehend the sign painted on the side of the van, and give it up. You going driving? She said blankly. Yes, I said, and fled upstairs. I always keep my bank book in an old Hyler box in the top drawer of my bureau. I don't save very quickly, I'm afraid. I have a little income from some money Father left me, but Andrew takes care of that. Andrew pays all the farm expenses, but the housekeeping accounts fall to me. I make a fairish amount of pin money on my poultry and some of my preserves that I send to Boston, and on some recipes of mine that I send to a woman's magazine now and then. But generally, my savings don't amount to much over $10 a month. In the last 5 years, I had put by something more than $600. I had been saving up for a Ford, but just now it looked to me as if that Parnassus would be more fun than a Ford ever could be. $400 was a lot of money, but I thought of what it would mean to have Andrew come home and buy it. Why, he'd be away until Thanksgiving. Whereas if I bought it, I could take it away, have my adventure, and sell it somewhere so that Andrew never need see it. I hardened my heart and determined to give the sage of Redfield some of his own medicine. My balance at the Redfield National Bank was $615.20. I sat down at the table in my bedroom where I keep my accounts and wrote out a check to Roger Mifflin for $400. I put in plenty of curlicues after the figures so that no one could raise the check into $400,000. Then I got out my old rattan suitcase and put in some clothes. The whole business didn't take me 10 minutes. I came downstairs to find Mrs. McNally looking sourly at the Parnassus from the kitchen door. You going away in that bus, Miss McGill? She asked. Yes, Mrs. McNally, I said cheerfully. Her use of the word gave me an inspiration. That's one of the new jitney buses we hear about. He's going to take me to the station. Don't you worry about me. I'm going for a holiday. You get Mr. McGill's dinner ready for him. After dinner, tell him there's a note for him in the living room. I tank that bane a queer bus, said Mrs. McNally, puzzled. I think the excellent woman suspected an elopement. I carried my suitcase out to the Parnassus. Pegasus stood placidly between the shafts. From within came sounds of vigorous movement. In a moment, the little man burst out with a bulging portmanteau in his hand. He had a tweed cap slanted on the back of his head. There, he cried triumphantly. I've packed all my personal effects, clothes, and so on, and everything else goes with the transaction. When I get on the train with this bag, I'm a free man, and hurrah for Brooklyn. Lord, won't I be glad to get back to the city? I lived in Brooklyn once, and I haven't been back there for 10 years, he added plaintively. Here's the check, I said, handing it to him. He flushed a little and looked at me rather shamefacedly. See here, he said. I hope you're not making a bad bargain. I don't want to take advantage of a lady. If you think your brother... I was going to buy a Ford anyway, I said, and it looks to me as though this Parcheesi of yours would be cheaper to run than any flivver that ever came out of Detroit. I want to keep it away from Andrew, and that's the main thing. You give me a receipt and we'll get away from here before he comes back. He took the check without a word, hoisted his fat portmanteau on the driver's seat, and then disappeared in the van. In a minute, he reappeared. On the back of one of his poetical cards, he had written, Received from Miss McGill the sum of $400 in exchange for one traveling Parnassus in first-class condition. Delivered to her this day, October the 3rd, 19. Signed, Roger Mifflin. Tell me, I said, does your Parnassus, my Parnassus rather, contain everything I'm likely to need? Is it stocked up with food and so on? I was coming to that, he said. You'll find a fair supply of stuff in the cupboard over the stove, though I used to get most of my meals at farmhouses along the road. I generally read aloud to people as I go along, and they're often good for a free meal. It's amazing how little most of the country folk know about books, and how pleased they are to hear good stuff. Down in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Well, how about the horse? I said hastily, seeing him about to embark on an anecdote. It wasn't far short of 11 o'clock, and I was anxious to get started. "It might be well to take along some oats. My supply's about exhausted." I filled a sack with oats in the stable, and Mr. Mifflin showed me where to hang it under the van. Then in the kitchen, I loaded a big basket with provisions for an emergency. A dozen eggs, a jar of sliced bacon, butter, cheese, condensed milk, tea, biscuits, jam, and 2 loaves of bread. These Meister Mifflin stowed inside the van, Mrs. McNally watching in amazement. "I tank this bane a queer picnic," she said. "Which way are you going? Mr. McGill, is he coming after you?" "No," I insisted. "He's not coming. I'm going off on a holiday. You get dinner for him, and he won't worry about anything until after that. Tell him I've gone over to see Mrs. Collins." I climbed the little steps and entered my Parnassus with a pleasant thrill of ownership. The terrier on the bunk jumped to the floor with a friendly wag of the tail. I piled the bunk with bedding and blankets of my own, shook out the drawers which fitted above the bunk, and put into them what few belongings I was taking with me. And we were ready to start. Redbeard was already sitting in front with the reins in hand. I climbed up beside him. The front seat was broad but uncushioned, well sheltered by the peak of the van. I gave a quick glance around at the comfortable house under its elms and maples, saw the big red barn shining in the sun and the pump under the grape arbor. I waved goodbye to Mrs. McNally, who was watching us in silent amazement. Pegasus threw her solid weight against the traces, and Parnassus swung round and rolled past the gate. We turned into the Redfield Road. "Here," said Mifflin, handing me the reins. "You're skipper. You'd better drive. Which way do you want to go?" My breath came a little fast when I realized that my adventure had begun. Chapter 4. Just out of sight of the farm, the road forks, one way running on to Walton, where you cross the river by a covered bridge, the other swinging down toward Greenbrier and Port Vigor. Mrs. Collins lives a mile or so up the Walton Road, and as I very often run over to see her, I thought Andrew would be most likely to look for me there. So, after we had passed through the grove, I took the right-hand turn to Greenbrier. We began the long ascent over Huckleberry Hill, and as I smelt the fresh autumn odor of the leaves, I chuckled a little. Mr. Mifflin seemed in a perfect ecstasy of high spirits. "This is certainly grand," he said. "Lord, I applaud your spunk. Do you think Mr. McGill will give chase?" "I haven't an idea," I said. "Not right away, anyhow. He's so used to my settled ways that I don't think he'll suspect anything till he finds my note. I wonder what kind of story Mrs. McNally will tell." "How about putting him off the scent?" he said. "Give me your handkerchief." I did so. He hopped nimbly out, ran back down the hill. He was a spry little person in spite of his bald crown, and dropped the handkerchief on the Walton Road about 100 feet beyond the fork. Then he followed me up the slope. "There," he said, grinning like a kid. "That'll fool him. The sage of Redfield will undoubtedly follow a false spoor, and the criminals will win a good start. But I'm afraid it's rather easy to follow a craft as unusual as Parnassus." "Tell me how you manage the thing," I said. "Do you really make it pay?" We halted at the top of the hill to give Pegasus a breathing space. The terrier lay down in the dust and watched us gravely. Mr. Mifflin pulled out a pipe and begged my permission to smoke. "It's rather comical how I first got into it," he said. "I was a school teacher down in Maryland. I'd been plugging away in a country school for years on a starvation salary. I was trying to support an invalid mother and put by something in case of storms. I remember how I used to wonder whether I'd ever be able to wear a suit that wasn't shabby and have my shoes polished every day. Then my health went back on me. The doctor told me to get into the open air. By and by, I got this idea of a traveling bookstore. I had always been a lover of books, and in the days when I boarded out among the farmers, I used to read aloud to them. After my mother died, I built the wagon to suit my own ideas, bought a stock of books from a big secondhand store in Baltimore, and set out. Parnassus just about saved my life, I guess." He pushed his faded old cap back on his head and relit his pipe. I clicked to Pegasus, and we rumbled gently off over the upland, looking down across the pastures. Distant cowbells sounded tankle-tonk among the bushes. Across the slope of the hill, I could see the road winding away to Redfield. Somewhere along that road, Andrew would be rolling back toward home and roast pork with applesauce. And here was I, setting out on the first madness of my life without even a qualm. "Miss McGill," said the little man, "this rolling pavilion has been wife, doctor, and religion to me for 7 years. A month ago, I would have scoffed at the thought of leaving her, but somehow, it's come over me I need a change. There's a book I've been yearning to write for a long time, and I need a desk steady under my elbows and a roof over my head. And silly as it seems, I'm crazy to get back to Brooklyn. My brother and I used to live there as kids. Think of walking over the old bridge at sunset and seeing the towers of Manhattan against a red sky, and those old gray cruisers down in the Navy Yard. You don't know how tickled I am to sell out. I've sold a lot of copies of your brother's books, and I've often thought he'd be the man to buy Parnassus if I got tired of her." "So he would," I said. "Just the man. He'd be only too likely to, and go maundering about in this jaunting car and neglect the farm. But tell me about selling books. How much profit do you make out of it? We'll be passing Mrs. Mason's farm by and by, and we might as well sell her something just to make a start." "It's very simple," he said. "I replenish my stock whenever I go through a big town. There's always a second-hand bookstore somewhere about where you can pick up odds and ends. And every now and then I write to a wholesaler in New York for some stuff. When I buy a book, I mark in the back just what I paid for it. Then I know what I can afford to sell it for. See here." He pulled up a book from behind the seat, a copy of Lorna Doone it was, and showed me the letters AM scrawled in pencil in the back. "That means that I paid 10 cents for this. Now, if you sell it for a quarter, you've got a safe profit. It costs me about $4 a week to run Parnassus, generally less. If you clear that much in 6 days, you can afford to lay off on Sundays." "How do you know that AM stands for 10 cents? I asked. "The code word's manuscript. Each letter stands for a figure, from 0 up to 9, see?" He scrawled it down on a scrap of paper. "Manuscript, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now you see AM stands for 10. AN would be 12. NS is 24. AC is 15. AMM is $1, and so on. I don't pay much over 50 cents for books as a rule because country folks are shy of paying much for them. They'll pay a lot for a separator or a buggy top, but they've never been taught to worry about literature. But it's surprising how excited they get about books if you sell them the right kind. Over beyond Port Vigor, there's a farmer who's waiting for me to go back. I've been there 3 or 4 times, and he'll buy about $5 worth if I know him. First time I went there, I sold him Treasure Island, and he's talking about it yet. I sold him Robinson Crusoe and Little Women for his daughter, and Huck Finn, and Grubb's book about that potato. Last time I was there, he wanted some Shakespeare, but I wouldn't give it to him. I didn't think he was up to it yet. I began to see something of the little man's idealism in his work. He was a kind of traveling missionary in his way. A hefty talker, too. His eyes were twinkling now, and I could see him warming up. "Lord," he said, "when you sell a man a book, you don't sell him just 12 ounces of paper and ink and glue. You sell him a whole new life. Love and friendship and humor and ships at sea by night. There's all heaven and earth in a book. A real book, I mean. Jiminy, if I were the baker or the butcher or the broom huckster, people would run to the gate when I came by, just waiting for my stuff. And here I go, loaded with everlasting salvation. Yes, ma'am, salvation for their little stunted minds. And it's hard to make 'em see it. That's what makes it worthwhile. I'm doing something that nobody else from Nazareth, Maine to Walla Walla, Washington has ever thought of. It's a new field, but by the bones of Whitman, it's worthwhile. That's what this country needs. More books." He laughed at his own vehemence. "Do you know, it's comical," he said. "Even the publishers, the fellows that print the books, can't see what I'm doing for them. Some of them refuse me credit because I sell their books for what they're worth instead of for the prices they mark on them. They write me letters about price maintenance, and I write back about merit maintenance. Publish a good book and I'll get a good price for it, say I. Sometimes I think the publishers know less about books than anyone else. I guess that's natural, though. Most school teachers don't know much about children. The best of it is," he went on, I have such a darn good time. Peg and Bach, that's the dog, and I go loafing along the road on a warm summer day, and by we'll fetch up alongside some boarding house, and there are the boarders all rocking off their lunch on the veranda. Most of them bored to death. Nothing good to read, nothing to do but sit and watch the flies buzzing in the sun and the chickens rubbing up and down in the dust. First thing you know, I'll sell half a dozen books that put the love of life into them, and they don't forget Parnassus in a hurry. Take O. Henry, for instance. There isn't anybody so doggone sleepy that he won't enjoy that man's stories. He understood life, you bet, and he could write it down with all its little twists. I've spent an evening reading O. Henry and Wilkie Collins to people and had them buy out all their books I had and clamor for more. "What do you do in winter?" I asked. A practical question, as most of mine are. "That depends on where I am when bad weather sets in," said Mr. Mifflin. "2 winters I was down south and managed to keep Parnassus going all through the season. Otherwise, I just lay up wherever I am. I've never found it hard to get lodging for Peg and a job for myself, if I had to have them. Last winter, I worked in a bookstore in Boston. Winter before, I was in a country drugstore down in Pennsylvania. Winter before that, I tutored a couple of small boys in English literature. Winter before that, I was a steward on a steamer. You see how it goes. I've had a fairly miscellaneous experience. As far as I can see, a man who's fond of books never needs starve. But this winter, I'm planning to live with my brother in Brooklyn and slog away at my book. Lord, how I've pondered over that thing. Long summer afternoons I've sat here, jogging along in the dust, thinking it out until it seemed as if my forehead would burst. You see, my idea is that the common people, in the country, that is, never have had any chance to get hold of books, and never have had anyone to explain what books can mean. It's all right for college presidents to draw up their 5-foot shelves of great literature, and for the publishers to advertise sets of their linoleum classics. But what the people need is the good, homely, honest stuff. Something that'll stick to their ribs, make them laugh and tremble and feel sick to think of the littleness of this popcorn ball spinning in space without ever even getting a hot box. And something that'll spur 'em on to keep the hearth well swept and the wood pile split into kindling and the dishes washed and dried and put away. Anyone who can get the country people to read something worthwhile is doing his nation a real service. And that's what this caravan of culture aspires to. You must be weary of this harangue. Does the sage of Redfield ever run on like that? Not to me, I said. He's known me so long that he thinks of me as a kind of animated bread baking and cake mixing machine. I guess he doesn't put much stock in my judgment in literary matters, but he puts his digestion in my hands without reserve. There's Mason's farm over there. I guess we'd better sell them some books, hadn't we? Just for a starter. We turned into the lane that runs up to the Mason farmhouse. Bach trotted on ahead, very stiff on his legs and his tail gently wagging, to interview the mastiff. And Mrs. Mason, who was sitting on the porch peeling potatoes, laid down the pan. She's a big, buxom woman with jolly brown eyes like a cow's. "For heaven's sake, Miss McGill," she called out in a cheerful voice. "I'm glad to see you. Got a lift, did you?" She hadn't really noticed the inscription on Parnassus and thought it was a regular huckster's wagon. "Well, Mrs. Mason," I said, "I've gone into the book business. This is Mr. Mifflin. I've bought out his stock. We've come to sell you some books." She laughed. "Go on, Helen," she said. "You can't kid me. I bought a whole set of books last year from an agent. The World's Great Funeral Orations. 20 volumes. Sam and I ain't read more'n the first volume yet. It's awful uneasy reading." Mifflin jumped down and raised the side flap of the wagon. Mrs. Mason came closer. I was tickled to see how the little man perked up at the sight of a customer. Evidently selling books was meat and drink to him. "Madam," he said, "funeral orations, bound in sackcloth, I suppose, have their place, but Miss McGill and I have got some real books here to which I invite your attention. Winter will be here soon, and you will need something more cheerful to beguile your evenings. Very possibly you have growing children who would profit by a good book or two. A book of fairy tales for the little girl I see on the porch. Or stories of inventors for that boy who is about to break his neck jumping from the barn loft. Or a book about road making for your husband. Surely there is something here you need. Miss McGill probably knows your tastes. That little red-bearded man was surely a born salesman. How he guessed that Mr. Mason was the road commissioner in our township, goodness only knows. Perhaps it was just a lucky shot. By this time, most of the family had gathered around the van, and I saw Mr. Mason coming from the barn with his 12-year-old Billy. "Sam," shouted Mrs. Mason, "here's Miss McGill turned book peddler and got a preacher with her." "Hello, Miss McGill," said Mr. Mason. He is a big, slow-moving man of great gravity and solidity. "Where's Andrew?" "Andrew's coming home for roast pork and applesauce," I said, "and I'm going off to sell books for a living. Mr. Mifflin here is teaching me how. We've got a book on road mending that's just what you need." I saw Mr. and Mrs. Mason exchange glances. Evidently, they thought me crazy. I began to wonder whether we had made a mistake in calling on people I knew so well. The situation was a trifle embarrassing. Mr. Mifflin came to the rescue. "Don't be alarmed, sir," he said to Mr. Mason. "I haven't kidnapped Miss McGill." As he is about half my size, this was amusing. "We are trying to increase her brother's income by selling his books for him. As a matter of fact, we have a wager with him that we can sell 50 copies of Happiness and Hayseed before Halloween. Now, I'm sure your sporting instinct will assist us by taking at least one copy. Andrew McGill is probably the greatest author in this state, and every taxpayer ought to possess his books. May I show you a copy?" "That sounds reasonable," said Mr. Mason, and he almost smiled. "What do you say, Emma? Think we better buy a book or two? You know those funeral orations." "Well," said Emma, "you know we've always said we ought to read one of Andrew McGill's books, but we didn't rightly know how to get hold of one. That fellow that sold us the funeral speeches didn't seem to know about 'em. I tell you what, you folks better stop and have dinner with us, and you can tell us what we'd ought to buy. I'm just ready to put the potatoes on the stove now." I must confess that the prospect of sitting down to a meal I hadn't cooked myself appealed to me strongly, and I was keen to see what kind of grub Mrs. Mason provided for her household. But I was afraid that if we dallied there too long, Andrew would be after us. I was about to say that we would have to be getting on and couldn't stay, but apparently the zest of expounding his philosophy to new listeners was too much for Mifflin. I heard him saying, "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Mason, and we'd like very much to stay. Perhaps I can put Peg up in your barn for a while. Then we can tell you all about our books." And to my amazement, I found myself chiming in with assent. Mifflin certainly surpassed himself at dinner. The fact that Mrs. Mason's hot biscuits tasted of saleratus gave me far less satisfaction than it otherwise would, because I was absorbed in listening to the little vagabond's talk. Mr. Mason came to the table grumbling something about his telephone being out of order. I wondered whether he had been trying to get Andrew on the wire. He was a little afraid that I was being run away with, I think. But he was soon won over by the current of the little man's cheery wit. Nothing daunted Mifflin. He talked to the old grandmother about quilts, offered to cut off a strip of his necktie for her new patchwork, and told all about the illustrated book on quilts that he had in the van. He discussed cookery and the Bible with Mrs. Mason, and she, being a leading light in the Greenbrier Sunday School, was pleasantly scandalized by his account of the best detective stories in the Old Testament. With Mr. Mason, he was all scientific farming, chemical manures, macadam roads, and crop rotation. And to little Billy, who sat next him, he told extraordinary yarns about Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, and whatnot. Honestly, I was amazed at the little man. He was as genial as a cricket on the hearth, and yet every now and then his earnestness would break through. I don't wonder he was a success at selling books. That man could sell clothespins, or Paris garters, I guess, and make them seem romantic. "You know, Mr. Mason," he said, "you certainly owe it to these youngsters of yours to put a few really good books into their hands. City kids have the libraries to go to, but in the country there's only old Doc Hostetter's almanac and the letters written by ladies with backache telling how Peruna did for them. Give this boy and girl of yours a few good books and you're starting them on the double-track block signal line to happiness. Now there's Little Women. That girl of yours can learn more about real girlhood and fine womanhood out of that book than from a year's paper dolls in the attic." "That's right, Pa," assented Mrs. Mason. "Go on with your meal, Professor. The meat'll be cold." She was completely won by the traveling bookseller, and had given him the highest title of honor in her ken. Why, I read that story when I was a girl, and I still remember it. That's better reading for Dorothy than those funeral speeches, I reckon. I believe the professor's right. We'd ought to have more books laying around. Seems kind of a shame, with a famous author at the next farm, not to read more, don't it now? So by the time we got down to Mrs. Mason's squash pie, good pie too, I admit, but her hand is a little heavy for pastry. The whole household was enthusiastic about books, and the atmosphere was literary enough for even Dr. Eliot to live in without panting. Mrs. Mason opened up her parlor, and we sat there while Mifflin recited The Revenge and Maud Muller. "Well, now, ain't that real sweet?" said Emma Mason. "It's surprising how those words rhyme so nicely. Seems almost as though it was done a purpose. Reminds me of Peace Day at school. There was a mighty pretty piece I learned called The Wreck of the Asperus." And she subsided into a genteel melancholy. I saw that Mr. Mifflin was well astride his hobby. He had started to tell the children about Robin Hood, but I had the sense to give him a wink. We had to be getting along, or surely Andrew might be on us. So while Mifflin was putting Pegasus into the shafts again, I picked out 7 or 8 books that I thought would fit the needs of the Masons. Mr. Mason insisted that Happiness and Hayseed be included among them, and gave me a crisp $5 bill, refusing any change. "No," he said. "I've had more fun than I get at a Grange meeting. Come round again, Miss McGill. I'm going to tell Andrew what a good show this traveling the Eiter of yours gives. And you, Professor, any time you're here about road mending season, stop in and tell me some more good advice. Well, I must get back to the field." Bach fell in under the van, and we creaked off down the lane. Mifflin filled his pipe and was chuckling to himself. I was a little worried now, for fear Andrew might overtake us. "It's a wonder Sam Mason didn't call up Andrew," I said. "It must have looked mighty queer to him for an old farmhand like me to be around peddling books." "He would have done it straight off," said Mifflin. "But you see, I cut his telephone wire.